My name is Darius, and I was 28 years old when I finally understood exactly where I stood in my family and how little my life mattered to them compared to money, status, and appearances, and that understanding began on Christmas Eve as I turned my old rusted Honda Civic onto the long curved driveway of my parents' estate in Buckhead, Atlanta, while the muffler let out a loud broken bang that echoed across the perfectly trimmed hedges and marble fountains, announcing my arrival like a public embarrassment in a neighborhood where silence and polish were part of the currency, and where every home belonged to doctors, lawyers, judges, and politicians who measured their worth by the shine of their cars and the size of their donations. And my parents, Leonard and Vivian Vance, loved reminding everyone that they were pillars of that world. And as I parked my dented car between a spotless Range Rover and my brother Trey's brand new Porsche, I felt my stomach tighten because the contrast said everything they believed about me without a single word, and I looked down at my hands, which were scrubbed raw, but still carried the faint smell of garlic onions and hot oil from the double shift I had just finished at the restaurant where I worked as a sous chef, a job I loved but one my family considered shameful and beneath them. And before I could even reach the front steps, the heavy oak door opened, and my mother Vivian stepped out dressed in a gold silk gown that probably cost more than my car. Her hair perfect, her jewelry gleaming, and her eyes scanned me with the familiar mix of disappointment and irritation, as if my presence alone lowered the value of the evening, and she hissed that I was late and told me I was still wearing that cheap suit again, and when I apologized and explained I had worked an extra shift because we needed the overtime, she waved me off and said she did not want to hear about my little cooking job, and then told me not to come in through the front door because Brittany had just hired a professional crew to clean the Fendi rugs, and she would not have me tracking grease and dirt inside. And when I stared at her in disbelief and asked if she really wanted me to enter my own parents' house through the back like a servant on Christmas, she told me I was dressed like the help anyway and turned her back on me without another word, and I walked around the side of the massive colonial house through damp grass, while inside I could see crystal chandeliers, glowing waiters moving with silver trays, and my brother Trey laughing loudly by the fireplace, holding a glass of expensive liquor like a king in his castle, while I stood outside in the cold trying to figure out how I was going to ask people who clearly despised me for help. And when I entered through the kitchen, the catering staff was busy plating food, and I tried to stay invisible, but Brittany, my sister-in-law, noticed me immediately and smiled in that way that never reached her eyes and told me they had a problem because one of the bartenders had called in sick. And since I was already dressed for it, she asked if I would mind circulating a tray of champagne for the next hour, and offered me $100 cash, saying it was probably more than I made sweating over a stove, and the room went quiet, and I felt my hands tremble because I wanted to refuse and tell her I was a chef, not a waiter, that I had studied for years, that I had worked my way up. But then I remembered the message from the hospital billing department that had come an hour earlier, final notice, and I thought about my wife Kesha at home on bed rest, pregnant with twins in a high-risk pregnancy, needing a procedure our insurance refused to cover, and I swallowed my pride and took the tray because pride does not save lives, and for the next hour I walked around serving drinks to my parents' friends, some of whom recognized me and looked away while others assumed I was hired staff. And when my father saw me holding the tray, he gave a small approving nod as if this was finally the correct role for me. And when dinner was served, I was allowed to sit at the table on a folding chair wedged into the corner like a child while the table overflowed with expensive food, and my mother presided like royalty, and Trey sat beside her as the center of attention, and my father stood and announced that Trey had closed another major deal, and then slid keys across the table to him, announcing a $2 million penthouse as a gift, and everyone applauded while I stared at my plate feeling sick. And then my father turned to me and mocked my career, asking if my little restaurant had lost its star. And when I calmly corrected him, my mother dismissed me, and Brittany joked that someone had to cook for people who mattered. And the laughter hit me like physical blows, but I stayed because I had to ask, and when dessert came, I finally spoke and explained that Kesha needed emergency surgery, and that we needed $15,000 by the next morning, or we could lose the babies, and the room went quiet for just a moment. Before my mother rolled her eyes and blamed me for marrying a woman without money, and said pregnancy was not a disease, and my father said giving money to me was like throwing it into a black hole because I did not bring value to the family, and when I raised my voice begging them and reminding them they had just given Trey $2 million, my mother coldly said that if I could not afford children, I should not have them, and in that moment I realized that to them I was not a son, I was a bad investment, and as I turned to leave a dry cough came from the head of the table and my grandfather, Titus, who had been silent all night in his wheelchair, slowly lifted his head, and with shaking hands pulled out envelopes and whispered that they were gifts, and Trey opened his and laughed when he saw the amount $500,000, and mocked Grandpa, calling him confused and fake, while my parents laughed and Trey lit a cigar and burned the check on his plate, calling it trash, and everyone laughed except me, and I opened my envelope and saw the same amount written on blue security paper made out to me with Grandpa's shaky but clear signature, and while they mocked me and said I was desperate, I folded the check and put it in my jacket and knelt beside Grandpa and thanked him because, real or not, it was the only kindness I had felt all night. And when I drove home through the rain to our small apartment in Vine City, I found Kesha in pain, clutching her stomach while water dripped into a bucket from the leaking roof, and bills and an eviction notice sat on the dresser, and when she asked what the paper was and warned me it could get me arrested, I still held the check because the signature looked different, more focused, like the man I remembered from childhood, and I sat awake all night listening to the rain and remembering how years earlier my parents had torn up my culinary school acceptance letter and locked me out of the house when I refused law school, leaving me homeless in the snow, and how Grandpa had secretly dropped me a single $100 bill wrapped in a napkin with the words "feed them" written on it, and as dawn came and the hospital deadline loomed, I knew that the piece of paper everyone called a joke was my only chance, and if it failed I would lose everything, but if it did not, then the family who laughed at me was about to learn the cost of cruelty. Grandpa Titus had not spoken a word through the entire dinner, not a single syllable, as the room buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and backhanded jabs aimed mostly at me. His hunched figure in the wheelchair was barely acknowledged by anyone. He was just there, a ceremonial placeholder, like an antique chair too precious to throw away but too inconvenient to use. They dressed him up for occasions like this, rolled him in, and let him sit there in silence while the family put on its performance of wealth and perfection. But that night something shifted. He coughed a rough rasping sound that cut through the noise, and everyone turned to look, and what happened next changed the entire trajectory of my life. With slow, trembling fingers, he reached into the inside pocket of his velvet smoking jacket. The entire room seemed to pause, watching his every move, unsure whether he even understood where he was and what he was doing. He pulled out 3 crisp white envelopes, and with great effort slid one toward Trey, one toward me, and the third toward Brittany. Trey snatched his, immediately smirking, probably expecting some meaningless card or another gift card to a chain restaurant. He had mocked Grandpa's gifts before, and he did not hesitate now, tearing open the envelope with a chuckle that faded quickly when he saw what was inside. He stopped mid-motion, his face frozen, and held the paper up to the light, checking it again, and again. $500,000, he read aloud, and the room gasped. My mother reached across the table, grabbing Trey's arm, and asked him what he just said, and he repeated 500,000 in disbelief, holding the check, as if unsure whether it was real or a prank, and then he laughed, a cruel, bitter sound that twisted the air, and said, "Oh, Grandpa, you really are gone, aren't you? You wrote a check for $500,000. Do you even have $500 in your account?" And my father looked embarrassed and reminded Grandpa that we had taken control of his finances years ago, that he did not have access to that kind of money, and he needed to stop confusing people with stunts like this. And Brittany giggled, saying it was like a prop for some joke, and commented on his shaky handwriting. I had not even touched my envelope, yet I was watching all of them, watching how quickly they dismissed him, how fast they turned their backs and waved away the possibility that he still had agency, that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a delusion. And when I finally picked up my envelope, I could feel it was heavier than a standard card, and when I opened it slowly and saw the check inside, it looked official. It was printed on blue security paper with the JP Morgan Private Bank logo, and it was made out to me, Darius Vance, and the amount matched Trey's $500,000, and the signature at the bottom, though slightly shaky, was clear and wet with fresh ink, Grandpa Titus Vance. I held it in my hand, stunned and quiet, and that was when Trey stood up holding his own check like it was a piece of garbage, and pulled out his expensive gold cigar lighter. He lit the flame and said it was trash, just like Grandpa's mind, and without hesitation held the check to the flame and burned it, letting the paper curl and blacken and fall onto his dessert plate, where it smoldered and turned to ash. And my parents laughed. My mother actually clapped, calling him terrible, but full of affection, like it was all just a game, some ridiculous holiday skit. And my father scolded Grandpa half-heartedly, telling him to stop handing out fake checks because it was behavior unbecoming of someone in his state. And the entire room laughed again. I looked at my check, I looked at the ashes on Trey's plate, and then I looked at Grandpa, and something strange happened. His head was still bowed, but his eyes were on me, and for a split second they were clear, not clouded, not lost, but sharp and steady, the way I remembered from my childhood. And he gave me the tiniest nod, like a signal, and I understood this wasn't random, this wasn't confusion, this was a test. And I passed. I folded the check, carefully lined up the edges, and placed it in my jacket pocket right over my heart. Then I walked over to him, knelt beside his wheelchair, and took his frail, trembling hand in mine. His skin was dry and thin like paper, but warm and alive, and I whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa," whether this was real or not. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years. And from across the table, Brittany snorted and said, "Look at him, poor thing, so desperate. He is actually going to try and cash it. How sad." And the rest of the table chuckled again, while I quietly walked out of the house, past the champagne and chandeliers, and climbed into my old Honda and drove back to Vine City, where the streets were cracked, lights flickered, and my reality was miles away from the glittering cruelty of my parents' mansion. The rain had picked up again, and the parking lot in front of our apartment was a swamp of mud and garbage. I parked next to a dumpster that had not been emptied in weeks, and the smell hit me the second I opened the car door. I ran up the stairs to Unit 404 and found the hallway lights flickering and someone shouting behind a door as usual. And when I stepped into the apartment, the sound of dripping water echoed from the living room, where the orange bucket sat in the middle of the floor, catching the steady leak from the ceiling. The air inside was cold, damp, and smelled of mold and silence. I walked into the bedroom and saw Kesha curled up on the mattress under a pile of blank. Her face was pale, her forehead slick with sweat, and her body curled around her stomach, her knuckles white from the pain, and her breathing shallow and strained. I knelt beside her and asked if it was the contractions, and she nodded weakly and said the medicine was not working and the cramps would not stop. And I felt fear rush through me, because we knew what this meant. Without the surgery, the babies would come too early and they would not survive. And I looked at her phone on the nightstand and saw the notification from the hospital demanding $15,000 by the next morning, and warning that payment was required before the procedure could be scheduled. And I looked around the room, peeling paint, the stained carpet, the bills stacked on the dresser, and the eviction notice taped to the mirror, and I remembered my mother calling me a black hole, and my father saying Trey brought value to the family. And I pulled the check from my jacket and held it up in the dim light. Kesha saw it and asked what it was, and I told her it was from Grandpa, and everyone else thought it was fake, but I kept it. And she looked at me with fear and told me I could be arrested, that he was not in his right mind, and it could be fraud. But I pointed at the signature and told her it looked different. It looked like the old Grandpa, not the one they treated like furniture. And I said I had to try because it was all we had. And that night I did not sleep. I sat in the dark, listening to the rain, holding that check like it was a life preserver, remembering the day I got my scholarship letter from Culinary Institute of America, and how excited I was, and how I thought maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to finally make them proud, and how my mother had laughed at it and called it servant work, and how my father had torn the letter up without even reading it and told me I was going to law school at Howard because he had already arranged it, and when I refused they erased me, locked me out, shut down my accounts, and left me with nothing, and I had stood on that porch in the snow with my suitcase while they turned off the lights and pretended I never existed, and how Grandpa had watched me from the library window and dropped that single $100 bill in a napkin that said feed them, and how that one act of kindness had carried me all the way to this moment. And as I sat there holding his latest gift, I decided that even if the whole world called it fake, I was going to believe in it because I had to, because I would not let my children die, because no one else cared to save them but me. The $100 bill my grandfather once dropped from the library window had bought me a one-way bus ticket to New York, and just enough ramen to survive my first week on my own, and standing now in that freezing apartment, watching Kesha shiver under 3 layers of blankets, I remembered how that small act of mercy had been the seed that started my entire life. It had not come from my parents, it had not come from the people who had always claimed to know what was best for me, it had come from the man they now called Scene. The man they rolled into dinners like a forgotten decoration, the man they left in a wheelchair while they laughed and drank and made decisions about his worth. I had once been thrown out like garbage for choosing to feed people over defending criminals or selling property, and yet here I was holding the only thing that might save 2 innocent lives. My phone rang. Precisely at 8 in the morning, the hospital billing coordinator's voice came through cold and professional. She reminded me that without full payment by noon, the high-risk procedure would be cancelled, the operating room would be reassigned, and we would have to seek alternative care. She did not wait for my questions. She did not care about our story. Her job was to deliver the message and move on. I stared at the phone for a long time after the call ended, trying to understand how this was real, how a country so wealthy could treat life like a luxury item only available to those who could pay for it. I had 4 hours left, 4 hours to find $15,000 or lose everything. I went to the closet and pulled out the only suit I owned. It was a charcoal gray wool blend I had bought secondhand for job interviews, and it no longer fit quite right. The shoulders were tight, the sleeve too short, and the fabric had started to shine at the elbows, but I wore it like armor. I adjusted my tie in the cracked mirror and felt the weight of the check inside my pocket hot against my chest like a brand. I kissed Kesha on the forehead and whispered that I would be back soon and that I was going to fix everything. Her eyes barely fluttered open, and she nodded faintly, too weak to speak. I left the apartment and drove to the Chase private client branch in Buckhead, the same part of the city where my parents lived, surrounded by high-end boutiques, private clinics, and country clubs. My Honda coughed and rattled as I pulled into the parking lot, surrounded by gleaming black SUV and sports cars, and I chose the furthest spot away, hoping no one would notice the duct tape holding my passenger window together. I sat in the car for a few minutes, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, wondering what would happen if the check bounced. What if Grandpa really had lost his mind? What if they called the police? What if I was arrested before I could save Kesha? I could already hear my family's laughter in my head, calling me a fool for trying to cash a fake check for $500,000. But I also remembered the way Grandpa's eyes had locked on mine, the moment of clarity, the nod, and I remembered the words he had whispered. Good now, I know who is real. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and walked into the bank. The lobby was pristine, a cathedral of marble and glass filled with soft hum of whispered conversations and the faint scent of expensive cologne. This was not a place for people like me. This was a vault for the elite, where the wealthy came to move fortunes behind closed doors. The security guard near the entrance watched me like I was a threat, his eyes tracking my every step. I approached the nearest teller, a woman with perfect nails and a frozen smile, and placed the check on the counter. My voice was barely above a whisper as I told her I needed to deposit it. She picked it up like it was contaminated, scanning the name and amount. Her eyes narrowed when she saw the signature and the total, and instead of typing anything into her terminal, she slowly reached beneath the counter and pressed something I could not see, then with forced politeness told me I would need to wait for a manager for verification, and gestured to a seat near the wall far from the doors and close to the cameras. I sat down, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and then I heard the heavy steps of the security guard, approaching, each one a slow march toward what felt like my inevitable arrest. He stopped a few feet from me, arms folded and body tensed, ready to act, and I thought about running, but there was nowhere to go. My phone buzzed, a reminder that the deadline was now 3 hours away, and I clenched my fists, trying not to panic, when a sharply dressed man in his early 50s appeared behind the teller desk and said my name. "Mr. Vance?" he asked. I nodded, and he smiled a calm, reassuring smile. "Please follow me," he said. "We can speak in private." I followed him through a corridor into a soundproof office lined with leather furniture and soft lighting. He introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, the private client manager, and said he would personally assist me with the transaction. He sat behind a heavy mahogany desk, typed a few keys, and turned the monitor toward me. What I saw made my stomach drop, not because it was bad news, but because it was impossible. The check had not only cleared, it had triggered something, a security protocol attached to an account labeled Titus Vance Revocable Trust. The balance displayed on the screen was not $500,000. It was $50 million. I could not breathe. I stared at the number, unsure if I was hallucinating. Mr. Sterling explained that my grandfather had created a blind trust in my name 5 years earlier, just after I had been disowned, and had been quietly transferring assets into it ever since, hiding it from my father and brother, because he knew they would drain it dry if they ever found out, and that the check he gave me was not just a gift, it was a key, a trigger to activate full access to everything he had protected and moved under my name, and that the moment I deposited it, the terms of the trust activated, granting me immediate authority over every cent, every account, every property. And that was not all, he said, and slid a document across the desk. A durable power of attorney executed that very morning, granting me full control over all remaining family assets, including the estate in Buckhead, and even my brother's investment accounts, which were underwritten by my grandfather's capital. I looked at the document, then back at the screen, and I began to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it felt like the moment the universe flipped over on itself. Yesterday, I was begging them for $15,000. Today, I owned their world, and when Mr. Sterling asked me how I wished to proceed, I told him to wire $100,000 to Northside Hospital immediately and mark it for Kesha Vance. I said I wanted the best surgeon, the best room, and the best care, and if necessary tell the chief of surgery I would personally fund his next research project if he kept my wife and our twins alive. Mr. Sterling moved quickly, making the calls and executing the transfer, and within minutes he confirmed that Kesha was being moved to a private recovery suite, and Dr. Evans was preparing for surgery. I let out a breath I had been holding for years. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled eviction notice from our landlord, Mr. Henderson, the same man who ignored our leaking roof and treated Kesha like an inconvenience. I called his number. He answered with irritation and told me that if I was calling about rent again, I could save it because we were out on Friday. And I told him I was not moving out, I was buying the building. He laughed until I said I was wiring $3 million that moment, and gave Mr. Sterling the routing number from the lease. Henderson stopped laughing and stammered that he would call the lawyers, and I told him to put the building manager on the line, the same man who told Kesha to use a bucket for the leak. And when he got on, I told him he was fired and had 10 minutes to vacate the property, or the police would be called for trespassing. And then I hung up without waiting for a response. Mr. Sterling handed me a sleek black debit card and told me it was temporary until my custom one arrived, and that it had a daily limit of $250,000. I thanked him and prepared to leave, but before I stepped out, a junior associate entered with a tray of coffee and water. She was in her 20s, polished and sharp, and when she saw the account number on the monitor, her eyes widened, and she quietly snapped a photo of the screen. While pretending to adjust her blazer, I saw her thumbs move furiously, and I knew exactly who she was texting: her sorority sister Brittany. And in real time, my entire family was about to learn the check they mocked was real, and that the chef they humiliated now controlled every thread of the Financial empire. I said nothing as she backed out of the room. I wanted the message to travel. I wanted them to feel the shift in the ground before I even walked out the door, because now I was not just their disappointment, I was their reckoning. The door to the private banking suite clicked shut behind me as I stepped back into the marble halls of that Chase branch. But this time everything felt different. Even the polished floor beneath my shoes no longer felt like enemy ground. It felt like territory I owned because it was, and when I looked over at the security guard who had been watching me like I was a threat just an hour earlier, he now gave me a polite nod, his face no longer tense, just professional and silent like a soldier recognizing a superior officer, and I returned the nod because I understood something clearly. For the first time in my life, I was not hoping for power, I was not chasing approval. I had it, I held it, and every second from now on would be used with intent. I walked to the elevator, rode it down with my reflection staring back at me in the gold-polished walls. And when I reached the lobby, I stopped in front of the same teller, the one who had summoned the guard with a silent button tap, the one who had looked at me like I was trash. I smiled at her and placed my new debit card on the counter and asked for a printed account summary. And when she saw the balance, her hands trembled and her eyes went wide, and I saw something flash across her face, a mix of panic and embarrassment and fear, and I thanked her, calmly took the document, and walked out of the bank into the cold Atlantic air. The storm clouds that had hung over me for so long felt like they were finally starting to break, but I knew it was not over, not yet, because there were still people who believed they were untouchable, and I was going to show them that their time had expired. I drove back to Vine City. But I did not go home, not yet. I stopped at a luxury tailor downtown and walked in, still wearing my cheap suit, and watched as the staff's skepticism melted the moment they scanned the card I handed them and realized who I was. Within minutes I was being measured and offered espresso, while 3 different stylists scrambled to outdo each other. And when they asked what occasion I was shopping for, I said war, and their laughter faded when they realized I was serious. I had the suit couriered to my apartment. I showered, shaved, and changed quickly, then stepped back out into the street feeling like I had been reborn. The fabric of the suit fit perfectly across my shoulders, and the leather shoes made no sound as I moved like I was floating. And I drove now in a rented black Tesla because it was faster than the Honda and more fitting for the message I was about to deliver. I pulled into the hospital lot and walked through the front doors, nodding to the security guards, who immediately moved aside, and when I reached the VIP floor, the same nurse who had barely acknowledged me the night before now greeted me by name and offered bottled water, and asked if I wanted valet for my vehicle. I stepped into Kesha's recovery suite, and the difference in the room hit me like sunlight. Instead of the dull smell of disinfectant and damp mold, I was met with orchids, clean linens, and soft jazz playing from a hidden speaker. Kesha was resting peacefully, her color improved and her breathing steady, and the monitors beside her showing calm, rhythmic pulses that steadied my own heart. And for the first time in weeks, I exhaled without fear. I sat beside her and kissed her forehead, whispering that everything was going to be okay, and I meant it, because for the first time I could back that promise with more than just hope. But before I could settle in, I heard a loud voice arguing with the nurses outside, and I stood up, already knowing who it was. The door burst open, and in came Vivian Vance, my mother, dressed in a Chanel power suit, her makeup flawless, but her eyes wide and frantic. In her hands, she carried a gift basket wrapped in gold cellophane, filled with overpriced chocolates and rare fruit, and behind her came Leonard, my father, still in his expensive wool coat, his face tight with concern masked in false dignity, and trailing behind them was Trey, whose eyes were bloodshot and distant, like a man still trying to wake from a nightmare. Vivian rushed toward me, arms outstretched, crying out my name like she was starring in a soap opera. She pulled me into a hug that felt like a stranglehold, clinging so tightly I could smell the desperation on her perfume. She called me. Her baby said they had been worried when I left dinner so abruptly, and then glanced at Kesha with a rehearsed smile and said I was a good husband for getting her such a lovely room. And then, with a voice low and sweet, she leaned in and said they knew what I did, and that it was brilliant that I had seen Trey burn his check and realized someone needed to protect the family assets, so I deposited mine to shield the wealth from danger, and that now I should do the right thing. In trance, for it all back to Daddy so he could invest it wisely. She promised they would take care of me, buy me a new car, maybe even a house, and that I could still be part of the family if I just gave it back. She smiled with that glittering smile that used to cut me to the bone. Not anymore. I looked at her hands gripping my arms, the same hands that had shoved me out the back entrance last night, and I gently peeled them away and told her she was right about one thing: the money was for investment, but not in her hedge funds, and not in their social climbing, and not in trade failed ventures. I told her I had already invested 100,000 into saving my wife, the woman she called a genetic mistake, the woman she mocked for being tired while pregnant with twins. I reminded her of her words that if I could not afford children, I should not have them, and I watched her smile falter, and I turned to my father and told him the black hole he spoke of had just swallowed the sun, and then Trey snapped, pointing at me and accusing me of manipulating a senile man and stealing his signature and claiming I had coerced Grandpa into signing over the assets, and he threatened to sue me, to have me arrested for elder abuse, and drag me through every court in Georgia until I lost everything. And I said nothing. I did not flinch, because 2 private security guards stepped into the room, and I told them to remove the trespassers from the premises, that they were disturbing patient, and they moved fast, gripping Trey by the arms as he shouted and cursed, and Leonard by the shoulder, trying to pull rank and status. But no one cared who he was. Not here, not now, not anymore. Vivian scrambled behind them, trying to hide her face with her designer bag, as they were marched through the hallway of the VIP floor, past doctors, nurses, and patients, all witnessing the fall of the Vance name. And just before the elevator doors closed, Leonard turned back, pointed a shaking finger at me, and screamed that it was not over, that he would ruin me and reclaim everything. And then the doors slid shut and silence returned. I turned to the head of security and told him that if they stepped foot on that floor again, they were to be arrested without warning. And then I picked up my phone and called Marcus Thorne, the best estate lawyer in the state, a man who hated my father for reasons that would soon become useful. And when he answered, I said 6 words: "I believe you have been waiting." And he replied, "I have been waiting for years." And I told him I was ready for war. And we began immediately, because I knew my family. They were not just going to roll over, they were going to strike back. And they would use every legal trick, every backroom deal, every ounce of their influence to try and regain control. And I could not afford to wait. I left the hospital and drove straight to the Golden Oak assisted living facility where Grandpa had been staying. But when I arrived, the receptionist would not meet me. My eyes, the air was tense, the lights dim, and I felt it in my chest. Something was wrong. I ran down the hall to room 304 and found it empty, stripped bare, no sheets, no photos, not even the scent of his cologne. And I turned back to the nurse's station and demanded to know where he was. And the administrator, Miss Higgins, stepped out, a woman who had always been polite until now, when she explained calmly that my brother Trey had arrived an hour earlier with a medical transport team and court paperwork, claiming Grandpa was experiencing a psychotic break and had to be transferred to a more secure facility for his safety, and that she had no choice once he presented a signed emergency guardianship order from a judge. And when I asked where he was, she refused to answer, citing privacy, and said Trey had instructed a full no-contact protocol. And I realized then that they had taken him. They had hidden him away in some locked-down building where no one could reach him, and they were going to drug him into confusion, into silence, into a shell of the man he was. And if they succeeded, if he signed a revocation while incapacitated, the trust would be frozen and my control revoked. Everything he had protected would be taken back. I called Marcus and told him what happened, and he said he had already seen the court alert, that Trey had filed an emergency motion, and that we had a hearing in 24 hours, and I told him that was too long because they would kill him by then. And Marcus said he would find him, and I told him to do it fast, or I would tear the city apart with my bare hands. And I meant every word, because this was not about money anymore. It was about justice, and about saving the only person who had ever truly believed in me. Marcus Thorne did not operate out of a shiny skyscraper with a panoramic view like the attorneys my father kept on retainer. His office was in a converted brick brownstone near Midtown, tucked behind a row of art galleries and jazz clubs. And when I stepped inside, I was hit with the scent of old Paper, ink, and vengeance, the kind of vengeance that had been slow-cooked for decades and was ready to boil. Marcus was waiting for me in a tailored suit that looked slept-in but sharp, and his eyes sparkled like someone who had been waiting years to bring a sword to the right battlefield. He did not ask for a retainer, he did not talk about hourly fees, he asked for one thing: the name Leonard Vance, and when I confirmed it was my father, Marcus smiled like a wolf, finally seeing the door to the henhouse wide open. He made a single call to a man named Silas, a former intelligence operative turned private investigator who had a reputation for tracking people and secrets like bloodhounds track wounded prey. Within minutes, we were in a black SUV racing down the highway while Silas sat beside me flipping through a laptop filled with GPS tracking footage, toll camera timestamps, and digital breadcrumbs. He told me that Trey's team had used a private ambulance registered under a shell company that led to a facility called Serenity Hills, which sounded peaceful but was really a privately owned elder care lockdown unit just outside the city, surrounded by pine trees, rusted fences, and no oversight. It was the kind of place the rich used to make inconvenient relatives disappear. Silas laid out photographs taken from a telephoto lens through a barred window. They showed Grandpa Titus slumped in a wheelchair, his head drooped, his body wrapped in a thin blanket like a discarded doll, and Silas told me his contacts inside the facility reported that Grandpa was being denied his heart medication and blood thinners, and instead was being given high doses of Haldol, an antipsychotic so strong it could sedate a horse. It was a chemical lobotomy. They were not just hiding him, they were trying to break him, drug him until he actually became the incoherent vegetable they claimed he was. And if they succeeded, if he died or lost mental competency before the hearing, then the trust would fall into legal limbo, and my power of attorney would be challenged, and all of it, everything Grandpa gave me, would be lost. Marcus leaned across the seat and said we were getting an emergency writ of habeas corpus from a judge he had on speed dial, and we were going to get him out legally, but we needed to be ready for a fight because places like Serenity Hills did not go down easy, and the people protecting it had powerful friends. And I told him I did not care how high the walls were or who owned them. I would burn them down brick by brick if they stood between me and the man who saved my life. We reached the courthouse just as the judge Marcus had called was finishing another hearing, and within 20 minutes we had a signed order and a police escort ready to raid Serenity Hills. We did not call ahead, we did not warn anyone, because we knew what warning would do. They would hide him, move him, or worse, we moved like a tactical unit. 4 black SUV and 2 police cruisers hit the gates of Serenity Hills just before dusk. Gravel, flying tires, skidding, flashers spinning as if we were executing a hostage rescue, which in truth we were. The receptionist leapt to her feet as we entered, her fingers hovering near a panic button, but Marcus slammed the court order against the glass and told her this was a federal action, and if she refused to comply she would be held for obstruction. The doors unlocked with a heavy buzz, and we were inside the facility. The stench hit first, a mixture of bleach, oldure, and mold, and something else, something stale and rotten like forgotten suffering. We moved through dim corridors where peeling wallpaper hung like dead skin, and we passed rooms where elderly patients lay forgotten, their eyes vacant, their bodies unattended. I could feel my fists clenching, I could feel my pulse in my teeth. And then we reached room 14 at the end of the hallway, where a heavy steel deadbolt had been added to the door like it was a prison cell, not a care suite. A police officer stepped forward, used the master key, and swung the door open, and there in the far corner, huddled under a gray blank, it was Grandpa. His lips were blue, his skin pale and trembling, and in Roman 4 was pumping something clear and dangerous into his veins. I rushed forward, yanked the Roman 4 out without hesitation, and dropped to my knees beside him. His eyes fluttered open, clouded with sedation and fear, and for one terrible second I thought I was too late, that they had erased the man who once dropped $100 bill in a napkin just to keep me from starving. But then his hand moved just slightly, and he whispered my name, Darius, and said, "I knew you would come," and I wrapped my coat around him and lifted him in my arms and carried him out past the staff, past the cameras, past the lies and the locked doors, and into the waiting ambulance outside. I held his hand the entire way back to Northside. And when we arrived, they brought him to a real hospital room with clean sheets and proper care, and a doctor who respected the patient, not just the insurance form. And I stayed with him all night, watching him slowly return to himself, his eyes sharpening with every passing hour like fog lifting from a familiar road. And when morning came, he looked at me and said, "It is time to finish this," and I nodded because I knew exactly what he meant. The courtroom was packed. Fulton County Superior Court had not seen a circus like this in years. My parents arrived in matching dark suits, their faces grave, their posture perfect. For the cameras, Vivian clutched a string of pearls and dabbed at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, and Leonard stood beside her, pretending he was not sweating through his shirt. Trey sat with his attorney at the plaintiff's table, jaw clenched, eyes sunken, looking like a man still searching through the ashes of the check he burned. They had filed a motion to revoke my power of attorney and freeze the trust assets on the grounds of elder abuse, claiming I had manipulated a confused old man into signing over his fortune, and the judge assigned to the case was known for a hard stance against exploitation of the elderly, and I could feel the tension as he glanced over his glasses at me like I was already guilty. But Marcus sat beside me, calm like a panther coiled, and waiting. His fingers tapped the table, slow and rhythmic, as the plaintiff's attorney, a man named Sterling, not related to the banker, began painting me as a desperate chef with a struggling wife and a mountain of debt, who had tricked his own grandfather into signing documents under duress. And then Brittany took the stand. She had traded her designer dresses for a demure cardigan and a single strand of pearls, and looked every bit the picture of upper-class innocence. And when asked what she heard on Christmas Eve, she told the court with a trembling voice that I had threatened Grandpa told him to give me the money or I would smother him with a pillow and let him die. And the courtroom gasped. My mother covered her mouth like she had just remembered it all too, and my father nodded solemnly, and the judge's face turned to stone, and I sat there not moving, my jaw clenched, my fingers digging into the edge of the table because I knew what came next, and so did Marcus. He stood slowly, adjusted his jacket, and said, "We have evidence to refute this entirely, Your Honor," and the judge asked if it was relevant, and Marcus said it was crucial, then pointed to the back of the room where the doors swung open and two orderlies rolled in a wheelchair, and sitting in that chair, upright, alert, and alive, was Grandpa Titus, the man they had tried to drug into silence, the man they had locked away. And when the courtroom fell into stunned silence, Marcus raised a flash drive and said, "Before we hear from Mr. Titus, we would like to enter Exhibit A into evidence a recording from December 24th made by the homeowner himself and legally submitted under Georgia consent laws." And despite Sterling's protest, the judge allowed it, and the screen dropped from the ceiling, and the video began to play high-resolution audio, crystal clear, the Christmas dinner captured from above, and in it every lie was unraveled frame by frame, word by word. And the moment Trey held the check to the flame and laughed and said it was trash, and the moment Brittany mocked me and said how sad, and the moment I knelt beside Grandpa and thanked him with sincerity, and the courtroom watched it all, watched as the family that claimed I was violent sat laughing while they burned $500,000 on a joke. And by the time the video paused on Brittany's smirk and Trey's cigar, the damage was done. The jury looked disgusted, the judge looked furious, and Marcus turned to Brittany and asked if she would like to amend her statement before the district attorney considered perjury, and she broke down sobbing, blaming Trey, and said he made her lie, and Trey yelled at her and called her weak, and the courtroom erupted. The judge slammed his gavel demanding order, but it was already too late. The mask had slipped, and the truth had landed, and everyone saw who the real monsters were. And then the judge called for Grandpa to speak, and the moment he raised his head and looked into that courtroom with clear, steady eyes and said, "I gave Darius that money because he is the only one who sees me not as a wallet, but as a man," the case was already decided. I looked over at Trey, who now sat slumped like a deflated balloon, his whole life unraveling in front of cameras and strangers, and I remembered his laugh when he lit that check, and I realized that he had not just burned money, he had incinerated his entire legacy with it. And I did not smile, I just turned to Grandpa and nodded because justice was finally catching up, and we were just getting started. When I walked into the hallway leading to my grandfather's study, it felt like I had stepped into another world. The air smelled faintly of aged paper and cedar. wood the walls lined with antique portraits that seemed to watch my every move, and each step on the thick carpet felt like a whisper from the past. My grandfather had always kept that room private a space, only he entered with the door always locked except when he was inside. It was the only room in the house not modernized, no smart lights, no gadge. It's no renovations. The furniture was heavy, dark, and ancient, and the massive oak desk in center of the room looked like it had been carved during the Civil War. I had been called here that morning by a silent text message from his private nurse, which simply said, "He's asking for you alone," and now I was standing in front of the door, my hand hovering above the handle, when it slowly creaked open from the inside, and there he was sitting in his wheelchair turned toward the tall windows, his figure framed by the pale winter light pouring through the glass. I stepped in and closed the door behind me, and he spoke without turning around. "You finally made it." His voice was quieter than I remembered, raspier but clear. "I said I came as soon as I could," and he gestured for me to sit. I pulled up a chair and sat beside him, and for a moment neither of us spoke, just the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the wind brushing against the window panes. He finally turned to face me, and his eyes looked sharper than I had ever seen, not confused, not lost, just focused, like a man who had been waiting for this exact moment. He handed me a small leather-bound journal worn at the edges and tied with a faded red ribbon, and said, "I want you to have this." I looked at it confused, and he said, "Read the first page." I untied the ribbon and opened the cover, and what I saw made my breath catch. The first page was a copy of the trust document, not the fake version my uncle showed the court, but the real one, the one my grandfather had signed over 10 years ago, and at the bottom was signature that was unmistakably his, and next to it was a date 1 week before he supposedly lost his legal capacity. He looked at me and said, "I never changed the trust, not once they forged the revocation. I was never confused, never incapable, but I let them believe what they wanted because I needed time. I needed to know who would stand by me when everything turned upside down, and you, my boy, were the only one who did." I sat there stunned, flipping through the pages, and inside were detailed notes, records, letters, copies of emails, and bank transfers, all proof that the trust was real and valid, and that my father and uncle had lied in court, had committed perjury and fraud to take control of everything and bury me in the process. And my grandfather leaned in close and said, "I left the door open just wide enough for you to walk through. Now go finish what they started and make sure they never take anything from this family again." I asked him why he waited so long, and he said, "Because I needed to see your heart, not just your ambition. I needed to know that you would fight for the right reasons, not just to win, but to protect what matters." And now I know. I stood and hugged him, and he whispered in my ear, "They think I am dead already, so let them be surprised when the grave starts talking." I left the study with the journal under my arm and walked straight to my lawyer's office, and by noon we had filed an emergency motion with the court to reopen the case, citing fraud and newly discovered evidence. The judge scheduled a hearing for the next morning and issued an immediate freeze on all asset transfers connected to the revocation documents, which meant my father and uncle's accounts were locked within hours. Their phones began lighting up with alerts, calls from banks, from advisors, from their lawyers, but they had no idea what was coming that night. I sat in the hospital room with Kesha, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks, knowing that tomorrow would begin the war for our name, for our future. I slept on the couch, holding the journal like a weapon, and when dawn came, I dressed in the same gray suit I wore to the bank because it had become my armor, and I walked into that courtroom with my head held high. My father sat at the front beside his brother, both of them looking smug and confident, until my lawyer stood and began reading from the journal, quoting exact dates and entries, then passed copies to the judge and opposing counsel, and the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. My uncle tried to object, claiming it was fabricated, but the judge cut him off, stating that the handwriting and signature had already been verified by an expert over the phone, and that the evidence raised serious questions that warranted a full investigation, and that until the matter was resolved, he was restoring the original trust's terms effective immediately, which meant I was back in control, and their accounts would remain frozen, and their legal authority revoked. I saw my father's face go pale, like a man watching his empire crumble in real time, and as I turned to leave the courtroom, I met his eyes and said, "You should have laughed less and listened more." The ride back to the hospital was quiet, just me and my thoughts, and when I walked into the recovery wing, the nurses smiled and nodded like they knew something had changed. Kesha was sitting up eating soup, and when she saw me she smiled, and I felt the entire weight of the past year lift off my shoulders. I told her everything, and she cried and laughed and told me that my grandfather was never as crazy as they said. And I agreed. The next few days were a blur of legal filings, hospital updates, and silent phone calls from relatives who once mocked me, now begging for meetings, for explanations, for second chances. I ignored them all. I focused on Kesha, on the twins, on making sure the nurses had everything they needed. And then late one evening I received a call from my grandfather's nurse. She said he had passed peacefully in his sleep, holding a copy of the same journal I went to the house one last time, and walked into the study and sat in his chair and whispered thank you. Then I stood and locked the room behind me and called my lawyer and told him we were going to war because my grandfather did not build a legacy to be stolen by cowards and liars, and now it was my turn to protect it with everything I had. The morning of the full hearing arrived with a strange kind of stillness in the air, like the world itself was holding its breath. And as I looked out the hospital window, watching the sun rise over the city, I felt a clarity I had never experienced before. I knew what I had to do, and I knew that everything my grandfather set in motion depended on what I did next. I left Kesha's room early, kissed her forehead while she slept, and made my way to the courthouse, dressed again in my gray suit, journal in my bag. A quiet storm building in my chest outside the courthouse. Reporters had already gathered, sensing something major was unfolding, though they did not yet know what. I walked past them without a word and entered the courtroom, which was already half full. The air was thick with tension. My father and uncle sat with their lawyers, whispering urgently, flipping through pages, clearly shaken by the journal entries my team had submitted days earlier. I took my seat beside my attorney and waited quietly as the judge entered and called the court to order. He wasted no time, his voice firm and cold as he announced that based on the preliminary review of the journal and forensic analysis confirming its authenticity, he was opening a formal investigation into the validity of the revocation documents used by the defendants to dissolve the original trust. The judge then read aloud an affidavit from a handwriting expert stating that the signature on the revocation was not only inconsistent with my grandfather's natural writing style, but showed signs of mechanical duplication, likely traced or copied from a prior document. My father's lawyer objected, claiming the expert had not interviewed the family directly, but the judge overruled him, stating that the authenticity of journal itself had been confirmed and was sufficient to proceed with a full evidentiary hearing. The courtroom grew restless. My uncle leaned forward, visibly sweating, and whispered something to his lawyer, who immediately stood and requested a recess to consult with his client. The judge allowed a 10-minute break, and as everyone rose, I stayed seated, my eyes fixed on the bench, my mind replaying every moment since the day my grandfather handed me that fake check, the moment that began this entire war. During the recess, my attorney leaned in and said, "We may be able to request a summary judgment depending on how the next witness testifies." I asked who he meant, and he said, "Your grandfather's former accountant. He just arrived under subpoena." I turned and saw him enter the courtroom, a tall, thin man with silver glasses and a leather briefcase, and something in his stride told me he had been waiting for this day as much as I had. When court resumed, he was sworn in and took the stand, his voice calm and precise as he explained that he had served as my grandfather's financial advisor for over 20 years, and that shortly before his health declined, he had been instructed to prepare a series of asset transfers into the trust for my benefit. As the sole successor, he described meetings, notes, emails, and even showed handwritten instructions from my grandfather, all of which matched entries in the journal. Then he dropped the real bomb. He stated that after my grandfather's diagnosis, he was approached privately by my father and uncle, who attempted to coerce him into signing off on a backdated revocation. They claimed it was what the old man wanted, and that it would protect the family from outside legal threats. The accountant refused, and a week later he was dismissed without cause and forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I watched the color drain from my father's face as the accountant produced the original letter terminating his services, along with a note he had written that day documenting the conversation for his personal records. The judge reviewed the evidence, then turned to the defense and said, unless you can provide contrary evidence by tomorrow, I will have no choice but to initiate fraud proceedings and potentially refer this case for criminal investigation. Court adjourned, and as we left the courtroom, I could hear reporters outside already on their phones, their voices rising as the news began to spread. I returned to the hospital that evening to find Kesha sitting up in bed, stronger, her cheeks fuller, her voice steadier. She asked how it went, and I told her the truth, that it had gone better than I expected, that we were close now, really close. She squeezed my hand and said, I knew your grandfather wasn't crazy, and I nodded, because now the whole world would know it too. The next day was quiet, no calls, no threats, no new filings, just silence until late afternoon, when my attorney called and told me to check my email. I opened it and found a scanned letter addressed to the court from my uncle, confessing to forging the revocation with the help of a third-party handwriting expert, whom he refused to name, claiming he had been manipulated by my father, who had promised to share the estate evenly once the trust was revoked. He claimed guilt and begged for leniency, hoping his cooperation would spare him from prosecution. My hands shook as I read the letter, not from rage, but from a deep, hollow ache, knowing that my family had done this to itself, not out of necessity, but out of greed and ego and pride. The judge responded within hours, announcing that the trust was now reinstated permanently, and all actions taken under the fraudulent revocation were null and void. The estate was returned to my control, the asset freeze lifted only for legitimate family use, and the court would begin criminal proceedings against my father, pending further evidence. When I told Kesha, she cried again, but this time from relief. I held her close, and we just sat there as the city moved outside, unaware of the war that had just ended. And then the final blow came 2 days later, when the family foundation my grandfather created received an anonymous donation of $200,000 with a note that simply read, for the future, not the past. I knew it was from my uncle, his way of trying to atone in silence. I did not respond. I did not need to. My work was not done, but the path ahead was finally clear. I began the process of rebuilding the family name, not through lawsuits or press conferences, but by quietly restoring every project my grandfather had begun. I hired back the old staff, reopened the scholarship programs, and visited every site he had once funded, shaking hands with people who remembered his name not as a man who gave money, but as someone who believed in second chances. And everywhere I went, I carried the journal not just as proof of what happened, but as a reminder of what could be lost if we let envy take root. One night, I returned to my grandfather's house alone and walked into the study. For the first time since he passed, the light through the window fell in the same place it always had, the leather chair still turned slightly to the side, as if waiting for him, and I sat down and whispered. I kept my promise, and for the first time in months I felt peace. I walked outside, locked the door, and watched as the wind rustled through the trees that lined the old path, knowing that while this chapter had ended, the story would live on, because legacy is not built in courtrooms or bank accounts. It is built in choices, in truth, and in the quiet courage to stand alone when everyone else walks away, and I had done exactly that. The days that followed felt both endless and weightless, like I was moving through time without feeling it, each moment passing like pages in a book already read. The court's final order had restored the trust and the legacy it protected, but the damage left behind was not something a legal ruling could fix. There were phone calls, messages, awkward attempts at apologies from relatives who once laughed in my face when I told them I would fight. They wanted to meet, to explain, to reconnect, but I had nothing left to say to any of them, because when I needed them most, they vanished into silence. And when the truth rose to the surface, they only returned because they smelled the power shifting, not out of remorse, not out of loyalty. And I was not going to let them rewrite their roles in my story. Kesha was recovering steadily, her energy returning each day like spring, breaking through frost. Twins were growing fast, starting to crawl across the hospital blank. It's like little soldiers in training. And every time I held them, I felt something deeper than revenge, something stronger than vindication. I felt purpose, like my grandfather had passed me not only his estate, but the reason he built it. All in the first place, it was never about money. It was about family, about building something that would last long after he was gone, and now that responsibility was mine. I moved her to a private rehab facility, one that offered full-service care and therapy, and a peaceful view of the bay, and each day I sat beside her reading aloud from the journal, not because she needed to hear it, but because I needed to speak it out loud like scripture, carved into the foundation of our new beginning. The media had picked up parts of the case, by then mostly through leaked court transcripts and whispers from within the courthouse, but I refused interviews. I refused to turn it into a spectacle, because justice is not a show, it is a reckoning. And if you chase applause, you forget why you began to fight in the first place. Instead, I focused on the work. The restoration of the trust was only the beginning. There were properties tied up in bad leases, foundations stripped of their funding, programs cancelled by my father in a frenzy of control and optics, and I had to untangle all of it like a knot woven by years of greed and ego. I assembled a small team of advisors, loyal people, some old, some new, and together we audited every line of the trust, every expense, every signature. My grandfather had left notes about everything in that journal, every goal, every priority, and even a few warnings about people he suspected might betray him, including names I had never expected to see written in his hand, and he was right about all of them, every single one. The more I read, the more I realized he had not just built a financial empire, he had built a test, a gauntlet, that could only be passed by someone who valued honor more than comfort, and it made me feel closer to him even in his absence, like he had been watching, guiding, preparing me from the shadows for the moment I would finally understand what he had always known about the people around him, about the family we shared, and the battle I would one day have to face alone. One evening, I visited his grave. The headstone was simple, just his name and two dates and the words "built, not inherited," and I stood there with the journal in my hand and said, "I get it now. I understand why you never told me everything you needed me to find it, to earn it." And I did, and then I promised him that I would finish what he started. I would rebuild everything the right way and never let anyone tear it down again. From that moment on, my days were filled with meetings, phone calls, paperwork, site visits. I hired back the scholarship director who had been fired 2 years earlier, and together we reinstated every program and launched new ones under my grandfather's original mission statement. We visited local schools, met students, handed out acceptance letters in person, and I watched their eyes light up like fireworks, like someone had just opened a door they never thought existed. I traveled to rural towns where his clinics once operated, some shuttered, some running on fumes, and I funded their revival, bringing in new doctors, equipment, staff, and purpose. I made sure the people who had once depended on his vision knew that it had not died with him, that it was alive through me, that we would not disappear when things got hard, that we would show up again. Again, because that is what legacy demands, not a name carved in stone, but a life poured into action. One night, as I was reviewing documents in the study, I found an envelope tucked inside the journal, taped beneath the back cover, and inside was a single photograph. It was of me, maybe 8 years old, sitting on my grandfather's lap in this very room holding a toy check. He had written me for $1 million in big bold letters as a joke, and written beneath it in his handwriting were the words "someday for real." And in that moment the story came full circle, the fake check, the laughter, disbelief. It had all been a test, a message in a bottle launched decades ago, waiting to be opened only when I was ready to understand it. He believed in me long before I believed in myself, and now it was my turn to become the man he saw when no one else did. I framed that photo and placed it on desk where he once wrote letters to senators and presidents and heads of corporations. And I made it the symbol of every decision that followed, because it reminded me that trust is not built in courtrooms or bank accounts. It is built in quiet moments of belief, passed from one generation to the next. I did not seek revenge anymore. I sought restoration. I did not want to ruin those who wronged me. I wanted to outlive their lies with truth, with work, with dignity. And every time someone called or emailed asking for favors or meetings or quick cash, I sent them the same reply: I am not the boy you laughed at. I am the man he believed in, and I owe him more than silence. I owe him legacy. The foundation held its first full board meeting under my leadership, exactly 1 year after the day he died. And I began the meeting by reading from the journal his mission statement, his vision, and then I closed the book and said, "Let us get to work," and the room was silent for a moment before every hand reached forward, every pen hit paper, and the work began just as he would have wanted. And as I looked around that room, filled with people from different cities, backgrounds, and stories, all united by one man's dream, I realized that revenge may win the battle, but legacy wins the war. The months that followed became a rhythm of rebuilding, steady, deliberate, and focused, like laying bricks by hand, one after another, with purpose and vision. I no longer moved from emotion or impulse. I moved from legacy, from a place of knowing exactly what had been entrusted to me and what it demanded of me, and with every step forward, I left behind the brokenness that once ruled our family. The estate had officially been transitioned into my name. But I did not live in that mansion. Instead, I turned it into the Foundation's main headquarters. The old rooms where decisions were once made in secrecy now became open spaces for planning, for service, for community outreach. The study was preserved exactly as my grandfather left it, and every new hire was brought into that room first, not to impress them with wealth, but to ground them in the truth of where it all began. I kept the journal in a locked glass case on the bookshelf, a symbol not of scandal but of redemption. The team I built was lean, smart, ethical, no one with ties to the old power structure, and every project we approved had to meet the original vision: community empowerment, education, healthcare, and opportunity, nothing else. And I personally reviewed every grant request, every budget proposal, and sat through every board meeting, because I was not just protecting his name, I was building mine. One morning, as I sat in the office reviewing plans for a new youth center in a low-income neighborhood, I received a letter, not an email, not a phone call, but an actual letter, and the handwriting made my chest tighten. It was from my grandmother, whom I had not seen since the funeral. She had stayed quiet throughout the entire legal battle, silent as stone, and I never knew what side she had chosen, or if she had even chosen at all. But the letter was not long, only a page, and it said, "I watched you. I read everything. I saw what they tried to do. And I said nothing because I was ashamed, not of you, but of myself, for being part of it, for letting it happen, for choosing comfort over truth. I was wrong. And you were right. Your grandfather would be proud." And then she wrote, "I want to see you if you are willing," and my hands trembled as I folded the paper, because for so long I had buried the ache of her absence under layers of responsibility and drive, but now it cracked open, and I realized how much I missed her, how much I had wanted her to stand beside me when everything was collapsing. So I called the number she wrote at the bottom, and we met the next afternoon in the same garden where she and my grandfather used to drink tea in spring. She looked older, smaller, softer than I remembered, but her eyes were clear, and when she hugged me, it was not the hug of guilt, it was the hug of someone who had been carrying pain for too long and finally let it go. We sat for hours talking about everything and nothing. She told me stories I never knew about the early days of the foundation, how she used to handwrite thank you letters to every donor, how she had dreamed of starting an arts program for children, but it was always put on hold for other priorities. And I listened, not as the grandson who had been betrayed, but as the man who now held the keys to change it. And before we parted, I promised her that the arts program would be launched by the end of the year, fully funded in her name, and I meant every word. And when she left, I stood there for a long time, thinking about how many parts of my family had been shattered. And yet here we were piecing some of it back together, not for appearances, but for healing, and healing became a big part of my mission than I expected. I hired counselors to work with children in the programs we funded. I added mental health services to the clinics, and I personally spoke at schools about resilience and forgiveness, because I had learned that power without purpose is empty, and pain without transformation is just trauma on repeat. Then one night, as I was closing up the office, I saw an envelope slid under the door, no name, no markings, just thick paper. And inside was a single page typed with no signature, and it said, "You do not know me, but I knew your grandfather. I owed him more than I can ever repay." And I watched from the sidelines as they tried to erase his legacy, and I could not stay silent any longer. Enclosed are documents that may help you finish what you started, and attached was a flash drive. When I opened it later that night, it contained financial records, transaction history, and correspondence, all pointing to a shadow deal made by my father long before my grandfather passed, offloading foundation assets into a shell corporation with the help of an outside law firm. The names were familiar people who had appeared at dinners, smiled in photos, claimed loyalty, and it hit me like cold steel. They had planned this long before the illness, before the check, before the journal, and it had been deeper than I thought. So I took it all and compiled a final report and brought it directly to the Attorney General, because this was no longer about inheritance or revenge. It was about justice for every person who had been betrayed by the system, by those who wore suits and masks and used the law as a weapon. The investigation was quiet but efficient, and in time indictments followed, not just for my father, who had already fled the country to avoid prosecution, but also for the firm that aided him. Their assets were frozen, their licenses stripped, and while it did not erase what happened, it ensured it would never happen again. The judge who had presided over my case sent me a personal note acknowledging the final outcome and thanked me for my courage. I framed it not out of pride, but as a reminder that one voice backed by truth can outlast 1,000 lies. And in the quiet after the storm, I began to live again, not as a fighter, not as a survivor, but as a builder. I began dating Kesha again, not because we needed each other to survive, but because we wanted to grow together. Twins began walking, and I was there for every first, every stumble, every word. And one evening, as the sun set behind the foundation building, and I stood watching them play in the garden, I realized that this was the future my grandfather saw, not mansions or headlines or control, but this love, this freedom, this peace built from pain, not in spite of it. And I finally understood what the fake check really meant, not a joke, not a lesson, but a promise, and I had fulfilled it. As summer crept in and the light changed across the sky, I found myself walking through the garden one early morning, before the staff arrived, before any meetings, before any calls. It was silent, dew still clinging to the leaves and birds beginning to stretch their wings. And in that moment I allowed myself to breathe, really breathe, not just survive, not just execute, but live with the stillness and not feel guilt. I had come so far since the day I stood holding that fake check with my family laughing around me. I had learned that legacy is not something you inherit, it is something you earn and protect and fight for. And in that stillness I knew that the war was over, not because the enemies had vanished, but because they no longer mattered. Their power stripped, their lies exposed, their control shattered. And in the ashes I had built something real, a future designed with intention, not ego. And though my father was still missing, there were reports that he had been seen in the south of France, using aliases, traveling under different identities. There were whispers of frozen accounts of extradition, requests of silent settlements behind closed doors. But I did not chase him, because chasing ghosts only robs the living of peace. I left it to the law, and returned my focus to the living, to the ones who needed me now. One of those people was Darn L, a young boy I met through our scholarship program, whose story mirrored my own, raised by a single mother, no support system except for a fierce will to rise above. And I saw myself in him, not in age but in spirit, in that fire that refused to die even when everything around him told him to give up. I brought him to the office, gave him a tour, told him about my grandfather, and handed him a copy of the journal, and said, "Someday you will write your own." And he nodded with the kind of seriousness only someone who had already seen too much could have, and I knew he would carry it forward. And that was the point, not to be the last in the line, but to be a bridge to someone else. The foundation continued to grow now, with satellite offices in 3 states and partnerships with universities and health networks. We launched mobile clinics that traveled weekly to rural counties, offering care where there had once been none. And each time I visited, I carried with me the same pen my grandfather used, the one I kept in my pocket like a relic, not for signature but for remembrance, the pen that once wrote a fake check and now signed real futures. It felt poetic, full circle, even when the work was exhausting. I never lost the sense of purpose it gave me. And when the board held our annual summit that fall, I opened with a story, not of numbers or milestones, but of my grandfather, how he left me a piece of paper that changed everything, and how from that joke we built a revolution. And by the end of that story, half the room was crying, not because it was sad, but because it was real, and sometimes real is the most powerful thing you can give. We also began working with reform programs helping young men and women re-entering society from incarceration learn skills, find housing, and build purpose, because redemption was a pillar of our mission, and I refused to ignore those forgotten by the system. And one of them, a man named Jericho, had been convicted at 17, served 12 years, and now at 29 wanted to start a landscaping business. He had no connections, no credit, no investors, only a plan and a heart, and that was enough for me. We funded his startup, helped him get licenses, and within 8 months he had 6 employees, all formerly incarcerated, all building something they never thought possible. And when he came back to shake my hand, he said, "You are the only one who treated me like I was already whole." And I told him, you just forgot for a while. And that was the truth. So many of us walk through life forgetting our worth, letting people bury it under titles, shame, rejection. But worth is not something that can be taken, only hidden. And once you see it again, no one can put you back in that dark. And it became a theme in everything we did, reminding people of their worth, reminding them that they were seen, they were remembered, they were more than the worst thing that ever happened to them. And I lived that message too, not just spoke it. I visited every project at least once a year, showed up at the back doors, unannounced, asked the hard questions, listened to the small voices, because leadership is not about position, it is about presence, and I made sure my presence was felt not in dominance, but in commitment. And slowly, even the media began to shift, no longer chasing scandal, but asking how it was possible that something so broken became so strong. And I gave the same answer every time, because love is stronger than greed, because truth is louder than lies, because when you stop pretending and start healing, you become unstoppable. And that was not a headline, it was a fact. Kesha began writing again, short essays, poems, and sometimes letters she would never send, and watching her reclaim her voice gave me more joy than anything else, because I knew what it cost her to stay quiet all those years. And when she finally stood in front of our first female empowerment seminar and read her story out loud, there was not a dry eye in the room, because she told the truth, and the truth shook the walls, not because it was loud, but because it was free. And that night we sat on the porch, her hand in mine, watching the stars, and she said, "I never thought life could feel this full again." And I told her it can be more than full. It can overflow if we let it, and I meant it every day since the beginning of this journey. I had written in my own notebook the way my grandfather once did, not for evidence or protection, but for memory, for clarity, for honesty. And I decided that one day I would publish it, not for fame, but for the kids like me who once stood at the edge of laughter, holding a fake check, wondering if anyone believed in them. I wanted them to know that belief can be enough, that laughter can turn into legacy, that broken can become blueprint. And so I wrote every night, even when I was tired, even when the world felt heavy, because stories are what outlast us. They are what echo when the buildings fall and the headlines fade, and I wanted mine to matter. And so I kept writing. It was during one of our outreach visits to a rural town in West Virginia that I truly realized how deep the ripple of my grandfather's joke had traveled, because as I walked through the temporary setup of the mobile health unit, meeting with volunteers, shaking hands with locals, and hearing story after story of lives touched by the foundation, I was pulled aside by a nurse who looked young but tired, the kind of tired that only purpose can carry, and she said, "I wanted to thank you not just for what this clinic does, but because 10 years ago I was that girl sitting in the back of a classroom, not knowing if I'd ever get out of the cycle, and one of your programs gave me a scholarship, gave me a shot, and now here I am giving back." And she smiled and walked away before I could even respond, and I just stood there frozen, not because I was shocked, but because it hit me in that moment that the joke, that fake check that everyone laughed at, was no longer just a turning point for me. It had become a turning point for hundreds, maybe thousands, and the gravity of that filled my chest so heavily I had to sit down for a second under the awning of the clinic and breathe, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was grateful, truly deeply grateful, for the pain that had pushed me, for the betrayal that had awakened me, for the legacy that had dared me to rise. And it reminded me of something my grandfather once wrote in the margins of a newspaper he kept in his office, folded between Pages of articles and quotes. He had underlined a phrase that read, "Laughter is the closest thing to lightning when it strikes right, and next to it he scribbled, "Sometimes the lightning is fake, but it still starts a real fire," and I think that was the heart of it all. The fire was real, and it was burning brighter than ever. We returned from the trip with renewed purpose, and I called an emergency board meeting, not for damage control or crises, but to expand our reach. I wanted 3 more mobile units built, 2 more learning centers, and a separate branch dedicated only to rural development programs, because what we had seen out there was not just need, it was hunger for change, and I knew we could meet it. We had the resources, the people, and most importantly, we had the blueprint. And when the board approved it unanimously, I remembered the early days when those same kinds of rooms were filled with nods and smiles, but knives beneath the table, and now they were filled with builders, not backstabbers, and that was worth everything. The expansion rolled out fast, and within 6 months we had ground broken on every site and staff training underway, and it felt like watching a vision stretch across the country, like watching a tree plant roots in different soil and still thrive. In one evening during the construction of the second learning center, I received a call from an old teacher of mine, someone who had been silent through the whole family ordeal and now suddenly wanted to talk. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer, and when I did I heard a shaky voice say, "I owe you an apology. I saw what they did to you." And I said nothing. I laughed along. "I figured you'd disappear like others before you, but you didn't, and I just wanted you to know I see you now, and I'm sorry." And that was all he said before hanging up, and I stared at the phone, not with bitterness, but with clarity, because validation never comes when you want it, it comes when you no longer need it, and that is when it means the most. We hosted a scholarship banquet that winter honoring 50 new recipients from across the nation, and instead of hiring a keynote speaker, I told them I would speak not as the director, but as someone who once sat exactly where they were. And I walked onto that stage without notes, without slides, just with my story, and I told them about the fake check, about the laughter, about the silence, and about the decision to stand up anyway. And when I finished, the applause was not loud, it was long, it was steady, it was full of knowing, and I stepped off the stage into a line of students who just wanted to hug me or thank me or ask if they could one day what I did, and I told every single one of them yes, because they could, and because if I did not believe that, then none of this mattered. And that night, as I drove home through the snow with Kesha in the passenger seat and the twins sleeping in the back, I felt something shift, not in the world, but in me, a peace I had not known since before the check, before the betrayal, before the fight. And it was not the peace of completion, it was the peace of knowing I had truly begun. And when we pulled into the driveway, the porch light flicked on, and I saw a figure sitting on the steps wrapped in a coat, and it took me a moment to register who it was. My cousin Brandon, the one who had stood by me in silence, the one who had been exiled by the rest of the family for refusing to lie, and I had not seen him in 3 years. And as I walked up, he stood and said I did not know where else to go, and I hugged him hard and said, "You came to the right place." And we sat on that porch for hours, not talking about the past or the money or the trial, but about life, about what he had done in the meantime, how he tried to start over, how hard it had been. And I told him he was not alone, not anymore, and I offered him a position not out of pity, but because I trusted him, and I believed that loyalty should be rewarded, not punished. And he accepted, and soon became one of the most trusted members of the Foundation's outreach team. And watching him thrive, watching him reclaim his life, was another reminder that revenge is loud, but redemption is louder, and I wanted to keep choosing the louder sound in everything I did. The months that followed felt like a dream being built in real time, each brick laid with purpose, each connection forged with memory. And even though the scars of what had been done to me still ached on some nights, they no longer defined me, they no longer dictated my silence or directed my steps. They simply reminded me how far I had come and how deep the betrayal once cut. And it was during one of those quiet nights, sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the moon reflect off the glass surface of the backyard pond, that Kesha turned to me and asked a question that stayed with me longer than any courtroom line. She said, "Do you think your grandfather planned all of this, like really planned it?" And for a moment I did not respond because the question was too big to answer quickly. So I sat with it, let the wind move through the trees, and finally said I think he knew what he wanted to leave behind, and I think he knew that to make sure I was ready for it, he had to let me be broken first, because sometimes you do not inherit strength, you earn it. And that night I wrote that line down and used it to open the foreword of the Foundation's first official report. A full year into our independent operation, we released that report publicly, not just to showcase impact, but to reclaim the narrative, to own our voice, and tell the world that what began as a joke had become a revolution in truth and rebuilding. And as we mailed copies to every donor, every press contact, and every government official we had ever crossed paths with, I felt no pride, only clarity, because I knew this was not revenge, this was the record, the unshakable documented truth, and people read it. They responded not just with applause, but with action, because now we were no longer a fluke or a scandal, we were a movement, and more young professionals began applying for internships than we had space to accept. So we launched a mentorship program, pairing every new recruit with a former recipient of our programs, so the cycle of growth would never break. And in one of those sessions, I overheard a girl, maybe 19, telling her mentor, I used to believe rich people only helped each other, and now I know some people just help. And that line hit me so hard, I had to step outside and sit under the old oak in the lot across the street. And I whispered under my breath, thank you, Grand Pa, not because he gave me money, but because he gave me a path, one paved with fire, sure, but also forged with faith. And not long after that I received a letter in the mail, no return address, just my name typed on a white envelope. And inside was a single page written in shaky cursive. It said, I do not expect forgiveness, but I do hope you know that what you built from my worst moment has helped more than I ever could have. And beneath that was a name, my father's name. And I folded that letter once, slid it into my desk, and never showed it to anyone, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I did not need an audience. Closure, sometimes peace is a quiet thing, and I let it be quiet. And that same week the city awarded us with a community hero recognition and invited us to speak at a regional summit for nonprofit innovation. And while I stood there in front of business leaders and politicians and social workers and students, I told them the truth. I said, we did not start with a vision, we started with a broken moment. And sometimes that is enough. And afterward, as I walked off stage, a man in his 70s stopped me and said, I watched the news back when all of this was going down, and I figured you were another spoiled kid who would fade, and now I see you and I realize I was wrong, and I am glad I was. And he shook my hand with both of his and walked away. And again I was reminded that the loudest criticism often comes from people who are scared they might be wrong. And when they see the proof, their silence becomes respect. And I carried that with me into every project, every expansion, every new idea, including our initiative to bring therapy and emotional counseling into high schools, starting with underfunded districts, because healing is not just physical, it is emotional, and no one had taught me that better than the journey I had lived. And soon schools across the state began signing up, and we trained counselors and created youth circles and offered trauma support groups. And in our first year we served over 8,000 students, and one of them, a boy named Tarek, came to me at a meet and greet and said, I thought I was broken, and now I think I was just hurt, and that difference saved me. And I nodded and told him it saved me too, and we hugged, and that picture now sits framed on my shelf because it reminded me why this all mattered. And when our foundation turned 2 years old, we held a celebration, not in a ballroom, not with celebrities or sponsors, but in the park where I used to walk as a kid and cry after school. And we set up tents and booths and free food and music, and families came by the hundreds. And one of the final booths held a wall where people could write notes to someone who believed in them. And I wrote one to my grandfather and pinned it on the board and walked away. And when I came back an hour later, there were over 200 pinned beside it. And I knew then that belief spreads if you let it. And as the sun set and the band played its final song, I stood in the middle of the crowd and breathed deeply and said to myself quietly, this is what real legacy looks like. And I did not need applause or headlines to know that it was true. As the third anniversary of the foundation approached, I found myself revisiting places I had not seen since before it all began, not out of nostalgia, but to remind myself how the landscape of my life had changed, and one of those places was the old community library where I used to volunteer as a teenager before ambition and betrayal and inheritance and shame became part of my vocabulary. And as I stepped through its doors, I was greeted by the same wooden smell and creaky floorboards, and it struck me how unchanged it was compared to everything else in my life. And tucked in the back corner, I saw the exact same chair I used to sit in with a notebook on my lap, and dreams too big for the silence around me, and I sat there again, now older, now proven, and stared at that empty page like I used to, only this time I did not feel small, I felt full, and I wrote a single sentence across the first line which said, "You never know what the joke will cost until you have paid in full." And I left the notebook behind, hoping someone else would sit there and find it and maybe feel seen. And that same week, I received an invitation to speak at a national education conference, not because of the scandal, but because of the success, because now the work stood taller than the wound, and I took that stage in front of thousands and told the unvarnished truth about how pain can be a tool if you learn how to grip it. And when the crowd rose to their feet, I realized I was no longer trying to prove myself. I was simply trying to serve, and when I returned home there was a letter waiting in my office addressed with tight handwriting, and inside was a photograph of my grandfather taken decades ago, smiling beside the bank where he once worked, and behind it was a sticky note that said he always wanted to go out with a laugh, but I guess he gave you a legacy instead, and the signature was from one of his oldest friends, and I placed the photo on the shelf beside our founding documents, and the gavel used to launch the foundation board, and I said aloud, "I hope you see it now, Grand Pa, not just the result, the reach." And later that month, we held a reunion for every recipient of our programs and flew them in from around the country, putting them up in host homes and hosting a 3-day celebration of growth and testimony. And on the final night, we passed around a microphone and asked each person to share one sentence about what the foundation meant to them, and a young woman named Olivia stood up and said it meant that someone believed in me before I had a reason to believe in myself. And a man in his 50s said it was proof that mistakes do not have to be the end, and as the circle closed, someone asked if I would share, and I took the mic and said it meant that laughter does not always hurt, sometimes it plants something, and I felt the weight of those words because I meant them fully and completely. And in the days after the reunion, I began compiling all the stories into a book, not for sale, not for profit, but as a time capsule, and titled it From the Ashes of a Joke. And we printed 1,000 copies and distributed them to libraries, schools, and community centers, and made it available free for anyone who asked, and the demand was so high we had to reprint. And as I flipped through the pages of that book and saw my past staring back at me, not with anger, but with awe, I realized I had finally turned the page, not just metaphorically, but literally, because now my story was not just mine, it was ours. And during a staff retreat, one of our advisors said something that stuck with me. She said, "When you stood up in that courtroom, I bet you did not think you were standing up for all of us, but you were, and now we are standing too." And that truth sat heavy on my chest, because I never imagined that moment would echo this far, and yet it had. And that same week, the university that once revoked their award from me quietly reinstated it and sent a formal letter of apology, and while I did not need it, I framed it anyway as a symbol that sometimes redemption is louder than silence. And not long after that, I was invited back to that university to speak not as a cautionary tale, but as a keynote, and when I walked across that stage, I paused, looked out at the same rows of seats that once held laughter at my expense, and said into the mic, "I am not here because I was right, I am here because I refuse to stay wronged." And the room fell into a quiet that felt like healing. And after the talk, several professors approached and said they were sorry not just for what happened, but for not doing more, and I told them their presence now mattered more than their absence then. And we left that campus lighter than we arrived. And as the year came to a close, our foundation had grown from a single office and a single mission into an entire network of initiatives reaching every corner of the country, and still, I knew we were just getting started. The momentum we had built by the end of that year felt like standing on a train that would not slow down, and part of me was afraid that if I ever stopped moving, even for a second, the weight of the past might catch up again. But then something unexpected happened that made me realize maybe it was time to stop running and start planting deeper roots, because a call came through from a high school on the outskirts of town. The same school I had attended so many years ago, the same hallways where I used to walk with my head down, hoping no one would see how invisible I felt, and the principal told me they had been following the foundation's progress and wanted to know if I would come speak to the senior class about resilience and growth. And for a second I just sat there, phone pressed to my ear, staring out the window, because I never thought I would be asked to return, not like that, not with honor, not with purpose. And when I finally said yes, the voice on the other end laughed and said the students will be excited and maybe a little surprised, and I told her good, because I was too. And when I walked into that school auditorium, weeks later, everything inside me twisted, not with fear, but with memory, because it smelled the same, sounded the same, even the creak in the wooden stage was exactly how I remembered. And when I stepped to the mic and looked out at those young faces, I saw myself in them, and I told them exactly what I had needed to hear back then, that pain is not proof that you failed, and survival is not weakness, and laughter can sting but truth can heal. And after the talk, a boy in a faded hoodie came up to me and said my dad used to laugh when I talked about starting my own business. Now I think maybe he just could not see what I see, and I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Let him stay blind, your vision is enough." And his eyes filled with tears, and mine nearly did too. And that night I sat in my car in the empty school lot and whispered thank you into the silence, not to anyone in particular, but to the journey itself, because it had taken me from humiliation, healing, and then even further to helping. And the next morning my team surprised me with an announcement that we had been selected for a national honor, an award given to young leaders transforming trauma into transformation. And I stood on that stage weeks later wearing the same tie my grandfather gave me, the same tie he once wore to court, and I spoke to a crowd of thousands and told them that a fake check turned into the most real thing in my life. And after the applause, someone handed me a small envelope, and inside was a note written in shaky handwriting that said I was wrong to doubt you, and I hope you keep showing the world that love sometimes wears strange clothes. And it was unsigned, but I knew it was from my grandmother, and I smiled and tucked it into my pocket. And in the months that followed, we launched a podcast called What Happened After, where we interviewed people who had gone through viral stories, scandals, losses, betrayals, and who had found a way to build something stronger on the other side. And within weeks it had millions of downloads, and letters poured in from listeners who said they felt seen for the first time. And I realized that what I thought was just my story was actually a mirror for many. And during one episode I shared for the first time that I had once considered disappearing completely, just vanishing from everything and everyone because the shame felt so big, but that now I was glad I had stayed, because the storm passed and I was still standing. And afterward a listener messaged us and said, "I paused the episode and cried because you said what I could not, and now I think maybe I will stay too." And I stared at that message for a long time before responding with 3 words, "I am glad." And around that same time we received a letter from the bank. Yes, that bank, the one from the beginning. And it was not a demand or a threat, but an apology signed by the regional director, who said he had followed the story and wanted us to know the organization was working to change its practices to prevent future misjudgments. And for a moment I just laughed, not bitterly but with disbelief, because it was strange to see the wheel turn full circle, and strange to know that the institution that once mocked my tears was now quietly trying to do better. And I chose not to respond because I had nothing left to prove, and the proof was already alive in every program, every speech, every youth circle. And during a board meeting weeks later, someone suggested we expand internationally, and I sat back, looked around the table, and realized we could actually do it. We could go beyond borders and offer what we had learned to communities around the world. And I nodded and said, "Then let us begin." And we did, with pilot programs in 3 countries. And within 6 months we had real measurable impact, and local leaders saying they felt empowered and equipped. And one wrote to us saying, "We thought no one could understand our struggle, and then your story arrived." and it opened doors, and I printed that email and taped it to the office wall right above the original framed fake check, now yellowed with age, and I stared at both and thought how strange and beautiful it was that something meant to humiliate me had become a passport to global change. And as the year ended, we gathered for our team retreat in the mountains, and I stood by the fire one night watching the sparks rise into the cold, dark sky. And I remembered the first night after it all blew up when I thought nothing could be salvaged, and I whispered into the flames, "We are just getting started." The final day of the retreat arrived like the soft close of a chapter, and I woke up before the sun walked quietly to the edge of the overlook, and watched the horizon begin to bleed light into the dark sky, and I thought about every moment that had led here: the fake check, the bank visit, the courtroom, the shame, the fight, the rebuild, the ripple, and I breathed in the cold mountain air, feeling it stretch deep into my chest like the world itself had decided to inhale alongside me. And behind me I could hear the voices of my team beginning to rise, the low hum of breakfast, the clatter of mug, the rhythm of a morning shared by people who had once been strangers but now stood as family. And I turned back toward the cabin smiling, because I knew what we had built could not be undone. And after breakfast we gathered in a circle outside, each person holding a stone, and we went around one by one, sharing what we were letting go of and what we were carrying forward. And when it came to me, I held up my stone and said, I am letting go of the fear that my value depends on how others see me, and I am carrying forward the knowledge that truth has a gravity of its own. And after we spoke, we placed stones in the center, forming a pile that looked like nothing but meant everything. And later that afternoon, I returned to the city and walked into the Foundation's headquarters and stood for a moment in the lobby watching as young people filed in, some nervous, some excited, all of them unaware of just how much of my story was written so they could write theirs. And I took the elevator to the top floor where my office overlooked the city. And I stood there remembering the bank tower where it all began. And then I turned away because the past had been faced and the future was wide open and over the next few months we expanded even further, opening satellite offices in 7 new states and launching mobile outreach units that could bring resources into rural and underserved communities. And in every new place I saw reflections of the same spark, the same hunger for dignity and second chances. And one day, while visiting one of the new centers in the Midwest, a small boy tugged on my coat and asked if I was the guy from the book. And when I said yes, he smiled and said, "My sister says you used to cry a lot, but you are strong now." And I knelt down, looked him in the eye, and said, "Crying is strong." And he nodded like he already knew, and I felt something inside me settle. And not long after that I was approached by a film producer who wanted to adapt the story not for drama but for truth. And after many long conversations, I agreed under one condition: that the story end not with the courtroom or the scandal or even the award, but with the moment the first student from our program walked across a graduation stage and became the first in their family to do so. And the producer smiled and said, "Then that is the final scene." And when that film finally aired years later, I sat in the back of a packed theater unnoticed and watched my younger self stumble, fall, rise, speak, cry, build. And when the credits rolled, the entire audience sat silent before rising to their feet, and I slipped out before the lights came on, needing the moment to remain private. And as I stepped into the night air, I looked up at the stars and whispered, "I forgive you, Grandpa, not because you earned it, but because I did." And from that night forward, I no longer carried the joke as a burden, but as a spark. And every time someone asked me how it all began, I told them it began with a laugh that cost too much and a boy refused to stay broken. And as the years passed and the foundation turned into a national model, studied in universities, funded by grants, visited by leaders, I knew that no matter how far it reached, it would always belong to that frightened boy in a bank lobby with a crumpled check and shaking hands, and to the man he became, and to the world they built between them. And on the 20th anniversary of the foundation, I stood once again at a podium, this time in the same city where I had once been laughed out of a courtroom, and I looked into the sea of faces, some old, some new, and I said the check was never fake, not really, because it cashed out into something bigger than money, something real, something lasting. And as the applause filled the hall, I closed my eyes and saw my grandfather, just for a second, not as a villain, but as a man with flaws and fear and humor that hurt, and I let him go. Finally and fully, and when the event ended and the lights dimmed and I stood alone on that stage, I whispered one last thing into the quiet, not a speech, not a quote, just 3 soft words: we made it. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.